I'm a long-time researcher and investigator, independent investigator, political investigator into the hidden government and hidden history, purposely hidden history, stolen history of the United States that has become a commodity of the national security state that has existed since late 1940s. And I want to put this in a broader context because I'm going down to the minutia, but I want to come back up to the broader picture because I think in the end that's what we need to be dealing with. But I studied many years political assassinations, and I grew up in the company in my neighborhood of employees of the CIA and the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is much larger than the CIA or FBI combined, but very rarely talked about, and other secret organizations. And so I know that there are two governments operating simultaneously, one that's visible and one that's not. But the broader historical context to talk about what happened September 11th has to be begun, in my view, talking about what happened after the end of World War II, even during World War II, the rise of the intelligence agencies and their importance in terms of international manipulation and control of the situation, and then the inception after the end of World War II, along with the importation of many Nazi spies and rocket and munition experts and political people that really led into, and this is not just me talking, I asked Bobby Inman, a former director of Central Intelligence Agency, who confirmed that these elements really were the architects, along with the Dulleses and others, of the Cold War that went on for many years and pitted the Soviet Union and the United States against each other in an arms race that gutted their industrial base and their economy outside of a select growing economy in armaments and other things, a permanent war economy, and an inception of a national security state. So all the important things that have been happening since that time, I believe, have to be related back to the beginnings of that control, and our history is then stolen from us by that national security state. It becomes invisible to us, and they carry out covert and overt wars and operations that have led to at least 10 million deaths since the end of World War II and intervention into the politics of hundreds of countries around the world. Another major factor that I think is part of what happened September 11th and the response to September the 11th has to be the history of the concentration of wealth and the technological developments that have been part of the transformation of the industrial age into the information age, and especially the model that grew up after the end of World War II, which was sort of the end of the colonial period, and then eventually even the neo-colonial period, to the period that we're now in that's generally referred to as neoliberal models of control, where you don't openly control the governments by a direct intervention. You control through economic manipulation, loans, structural adjustment plans, and other things that let you maintain an illusion of what they like to call a free market or a democratic state, as long as the democracy doesn't do anything to interfere with the general economic concentrations, or what Buckminster Fuller talked about in his last book, Grunch, he called it, gross universal cash heist. So that now the wealth and the power and technology are concentrated in very, very few hands. And when you have that development in capital-based economies, of a tremendous concentration of wealth and a leap forward in the technological capability, which immediately makes labor expendable to some degree, and devaluation of the currency per se, and now also add to that a situation where the real economy is no longer a production economy, but more of a service economy, and even an economy based on speculation about how money or investments in service or investments in products will do, like this huge Enron scandal about derivatives, which are 10 times the size of the stock market. An economy that since the 1950s hasn't run on anything except layaway plans and credit, with $7 trillion out in credit. So really paper economies that don't have to do with production, but do have to do with concentration of wealth. And what you get in these situations, when you devalue the currency and its worth, and you create a false economy or economy of theft, and you jump up in the technological capabilities and you concentrate the wealth, is you get a tremendous pressure for genocide. And that's exactly what marks the end of the Weimar Republic in Nazi Germany and the development in Germany of the concept of the useless eater, or the Untermenschen, or the person that was taking up space in the society. And depending on the biases historically of that society in relation to its membership and who has been cast out or seen as expendable. Of course, there were historical models, and the Nazis' defense of themselves at Nuremberg was in fact that they couldn't understand why the Americans were complaining because they had learned about concentrating people in areas. They had learned about genocide. They had even copied the national sterilization laws that they passed as the beginnings of the Holocaust from laws here in the United States and from United States practice relating to its indigenous peoples. Well, I don't think one genocide justifies another, but I think it ought to give us a little pause about what lessons we're sending out to the rest of the world. The technology of that death and that genocide has increased since that time, but overall I would argue that that has to be within this particular globalized and corporate model that we now faced, which is international. What we're seeing now, I believe, is the final stage of that, a power grab by the so-called free market countries, by the globalized countries and the wannabes, China and Russia, who want to be part of this emerging market economy around the world and concentrating its wealth into fewer and fewer hands. Is putting a pressure on that's leading us into a global and genocidal period of destruction of the world's people. So that built up as a major factor, certainly through the 1980s and 1990s, as the economy that surrounds this incident. And then in addition to that, there was, of course, the final remaining major obstacle to market expansion and to political hegemony in the world, which was the USSR. And so plans were made actually at the end of Carter's reign. Brzezinski now brags that it was not, in fact, Reagan, but Brzezinski and Carter who began the war in Afghanistan to undermine the Soviet Union and to drag them into what Brzezinski thought would be their version of a Vietnam War, and that would take up their resources and undermine their country to the point that they would be destabilized and fall apart. And so under their reign, they began to operate in such a way that they were backing reactionary elements in Afghanistan, which had a relatively democratic and secular government, which had a government that recognized women, educated women, had women in positions of political leadership, and gave them full rights. And instead, that government was undermined by the United States and the covert operations that it did there for many years. And then, of course, through the Reagan years, what they called the freedom fighters. Another current context, I think, that's a little broader than the immediate events, and certainly explains a great deal more about what we're doing in response to these events, is that from 1996 to 2000, there were very active plans to create pipelines that would capture the oil of the Caspian Sea region to the north of Afghanistan, and those pipeline plans involved corporations like Unocal, a big oil company, Halliburton, which you may have heard of. Dick Cheney worked for Halliburton, which is an oil supply company. And when their pipeline was compromised by the Taliban, a second route was developed by a company you may also have heard of in the news called Enron. But there are pipeline wars that have been going on about capture that oil, and I'll get back to that. But I think and I also want to get back to the broader question of what is happening now, because I do think that we're at the equivalent of a crossroads in modern human history. I don't think it happened as a result of September the 11th, but I think September the 11th, to those as can take the message, ought to be the final wake-up call that you need in order to take your responsibility as a citizen in this country in actually the last pocket of relative information flow and privilege in the world that has any chance of stopping this genocidal juggernaut. But to go back a little bit further, because I used to work with an investigative researcher for about 20 years until the time of her death, named Mae Brussel. And Mae was indefatigable. She clipped 15 to 20 daily newspapers, 150 periodicals a month. She read 300 to 500 books a year. She broke down the news. She spent 8 years cross-reference indexing the Warren Commission volumes. And she broke the code. She figured out who knew who. And she figured it out enough that she probably could have done better. She used to tell me working as a psychic, and everybody would have loved her for her predictions, but instead she was called a conspiracy nut when she told Rose Kennedy 5 days before Bobby was killed that the forces that had killed John were moving on her son in California, or called Mary Jo Kopechne's parents 3 days before Chappaquiddick and told them that they were about to kill their daughter. But I used to say to May at one point, because I used to clip the New York Times and the Washington Post daily, I don't do that anymore because the content available in the papers has reduced to a point that it's not worth the effort. There's still a little bit. You know, Jefferson used to say that given a choice between a government without a newspaper or a newspaper without a government, he would always choose the latter, and I agree with him, but he never read the New York Times or the Washington Post. Or the current, what we call media, this form of sort of disinformation-tainment that we have that passes for some kind of news. But even then, I said to May, I mean, before we got into the total disconnect point, because there is a little bit in the obituaries and sometimes in the social page that tell you something at last about the ruling class, who's in it and who they know and what they do. But I suggested back then, while she was still alive, that knowing what we did by then about the characters involved in modern history, that we ought to go back to November 22nd, 1963 and begin to clip backwards. Because they weren't covering their fannies quite so well, and we could find out a great deal more knowing the general picture. And I still would suggest that that's a useful exercise for those who want to do any research in the post-literate world, where reading is a subversive activity. But I did the same in relation then to September the 11th. I thought it was worth clipping backwards a little bit. So to take us back to the beginning of the year, you may remember I wore a button for a great deal of time up to September 11th, and it was very popular in D.C., and I always had to carry an extra copy of it because people would ask me for a copy on the street. And after September 11th, I stopped wearing it, not because I was afraid to wear it, but I was afraid no one would understand what it meant. And the button said, "Bush doesn't count." And everybody got it. So you may remember that there was an open electoral takeover and an ascendancy of Bush into power. Now, I spoke in Philadelphia prior to the election saying that that would be the case, because I am well aware that the United States does not let the election of significant representatives of its people and the government here come down to a vote. It cannot afford for it to come down to a vote. If we know that the government in the 1970s would spend $10 million to influence the outcome of an election in Chile, how much do you think they spend here where it actually counts? So the only thing that was striking to me during those few days of interchange was that they went outside the script. In my lifetime, the script has always been that they put forward two candidates for the two parties, and no other candidates or points of view are allowed. They frame the debate in which they say the issues that the people care about are debated. They go to great lengths among these candidates to make you feel that there's some difference between them. I call them the evil of two lessers. And I don't vote for elected officials, as the majority of people don't. And actually, technically, if you want to go by the vote, nobody's president and hasn't been for a long time, because the majority of the American people don't vote. But they went through this little play game, and it got up to, well, then they'll have a debate, and then they'll have a poll. Now, I don't know the purpose of a poll in a democratic society prior to the election except to influence the election. And you'll actually get people saying, well, I don't want to vote for a loser and waste my vote, so they'll vote the other way. But in addition to that, it still doesn't matter. I mean, you know, they'll take a landslide if they could get one, but if they have to, they'll miscount the votes. And so they'll give you a poll, they'll tell you who's going to win. Maybe if they think you're too bored with it, they'll have a little horse race like they did this time and make you think there's actually something going on out there on the track, you know, and it's nose to nose and it's Bush to Gore and it's, you know, but coming down to the line, the point is that elections in the United States are ascendancies of particular segments of the class. And so when Clinton was inaugurated, on the local news in TV news in D.C., they had Poppy Bush, as he's called by the family, the father, former director of the CIA, was there sort of snarling into the camera as he left town on the plane, and he said, I'll give him his term, but I'm coming back. And I took Bush seriously because I felt that Bush had been president at that point since March 31, 1981, which is the day on which Reagan is nearly killed in a shooting incident that involves a fellow named Hinckley, and the Hinckley and Bush families are like this financially and socially for several decades. And so I'm sure that Reagan took the message when he found out who Mr. Hinckley was, who was doing the shooting, and after that he went and watched movies at Camp David and waved to the press under the helicopter, but Bush was president. And so when he said he was going to come back, I assumed that he would come back. And when I saw that Shrub was the candidate this time around, George W., who was actually the only option they had. They couldn't run Jeb or Neil because that would have created huge scandals. I mean, he was the only one that was so dumb they hadn't involved him in the criminal activity of the family. I mean, the problem is not that the emperor has no clothes, it's that he has no brain and nobody's willing to say it. You see, I mean, now he's suddenly ascended into some sort of vaunted leadership and he's making these brilliant speeches. If you listen to this, I mean, I feel like I'm listening to a 12-year-old describing a video game. There's the evil guys and then us good guys, and I mean, we're going to get them and smoke them out. And, you know, I mean, I don't know who he's talking to, but, you know, it's, and, you know, at least he's doing a little better at reading the prompter, so you have to give him that. But, I mean, this is not a bright boy. The running joke in D.C. is that if Cheney has a heart attack, Bush could become president. But I knew that he would be president, and I said as much, and I had some nervous Nellies that wanted to vote for Ralph Nader, and they said, oh, well, if I vote for Nader, will I be voting, you know, for Bush? And I said, no, a vote for Gore is a vote for Bush. If you want to vote for Nader, go ahead and vote for Nader. Maybe they'll admit that you got 5%, you know. But I don't want a third party or a fourth party because I think parties are inimical to democracy, and so did Jefferson, so did Washington. But in any case, after they do the debates and they do the poll and they come up to election night, then what they do is they take exit polls and they count the votes as they're coming in across the country, and the network news will announce to you, based on these exit polls and projections, who the President of the United States is, who's going to win the election. And then the other candidate will get up and concede. And then you've got a president. Now that's the script. The script has nothing to do with recounting votes, waiting for absentee votes, checking this or that, even waiting for the final exit votes to come in or all the polls to close. You're just told and the other guy concedes. And that started to happen, and then all of a sudden Gore balked and said that he wasn't going to concede on the vote and he was going to fight it. And I thought, what on earth is going on? I mean, Gore is as much of a player in this game as Bush is. Everybody at that level is in on the shill, so it's not a matter of they're fighting tooth and nail for this position. And in fact, the Democrats, the way they fought it, was guaranteed to make sure that the vote came out for the Republicans anyway, you know, and Gore went off and grew his beard and has been quiet as a mouse. So, I mean, that wasn't the point, but it was just that there they are out of the script, and it took me a little while to get it that they wanted us to know, that they were sending us a message as blatant as the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, and the message is, you don't elect the president. And they pulled up that petticoat, and not just us, but the whole world saw that the United States is not an electoral democracy, even for its so-called representative class. And that's a message they wanted you to get at the beginning of the year as Bush came in. By early spring, indicators started to come in that Bush and the economy here in the United States, as well as worldwide, was in some trouble. There was, in fact, the beginnings of what continues as a worldwide economic slump, and the early hints of a recession here and a lack of this great surplus economy that Bush was promising. But he had already promised the cuts to the rich and the tax rebate to the rest of us. And also in the spring, the Central Intelligence Agency in the U.S. sent $43 million to the Taliban in order to get them to stop growing opium in the southern part of Afghanistan, and they were complying with that to some extent, and then the Northern Alliance took over growing the opium instead. And then in July of last year, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, made a special trip that it was reported on in Times of India to Pakistan and India and Uzbekistan and surrounding countries around Afghanistan, and he told the leaders of those countries that the United States would militarily intervene in mid-October in Afghanistan. This is in July. So you have to understand that this war is not in response to September the 11th. In fact, it may be the other way around. I mean, they like to compare it to Pearl Harbor. Well, it does compare to Pearl Harbor because they knew Pearl Harbor was coming. They broke the code in advance. They goaded the Japanese militarist class by boycotting the oil to Japan. And they got an attack, and they stood back and took the attack because it let them get into a war. But just understand that Colin Powell was telling the surrounding countries in July that we were going to go into Afghanistan in mid-October. On August the 21st, there was a revealing article on the front page of the Washington Post that revealed a split between the White House and the Pentagon. And they were having an argument between the heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Pentagon staff that was coming in, Rumsfeld and these others, and it had to do with the White House point of view, agreeing with a right-wing think tank writer that the United States is an empire, and it ought to admit that it's an empire and get about the business of being an empire, and this sort of Pax Americana idea. The Pentagon people, on the other hand, said, look, we've got enough to do already. And we don't need to go that route. After that, of course, they switched over the head of the Joint Chiefs, the head of the Air Force has changed, and a lot different people are in there making the planning, and Bush, of course, has a stronger hand in terms of any planning, as well as Rumsfeld and these others in the White House and Cheney. But that argument was revealed in late August. By September the 1st, it was clear that Bush and the economy were in trouble, that the economy was going from a surplus to a deficit in terms of the taxes. Bush's domestic policy was in a great deal of trouble in Congress, and Bush had gone low in the acceptance polls. And so he wasn't on exactly the fast track that he had been coming in. Also in early September, you may remember, there were Cubans arrested and at trial for spying on domestic Cuban terrorist groups that had been attacking Castro. And some Cubans from Cuba came into the United States and began to infiltrate those groups, and then they were charging them with spying here. Even though they weren't spying on the U.S. government, they were spying on these Cuban organizations. Death squad victims that were buried in mass graves were discovered in Guatemala at the sites of the Central Intelligence Agency camps there from terrorist activities that we had taken part on. Privatization deals at the Caspian Sea region for the oil in Azerbaijan caused some international flap that was reported in the Wall Street Journal and other places. The United States and the CIA were busy funding 300 non-government organizations and creating a terror campaign that was compared in its scope to the Contra War in Nicaragua in Belarus, a country that had formerly been part of the Soviet Union, also was what's considered white Russia historically, and the site of a great deal of the early opposition to the Bolsheviks. And it was being reported somewhat in the news at the beginning of September. The U.S. was carrying on a terrorist campaign to overthrow the government in Belarus and change an election that was going on there. On the 5th of September, it was reported that the CIA would get its own primetime show on CBS, depicting the CIA in a good light. And United States troops were reported that day to be staging what was called the world's largest military maneuvers to date in Egypt. On the 4th and 5th of September, both the New York Times and the London Sunday Times revealed something called Operation Clear Vision, run by the CIA, and plans by the CIA and the Defense Intelligence to test anthrax. Operation Clear Vision caused a flap because it seemed to be in clear violation of treaties the U.S. had signed and agreements it had made not to develop anything relating to chemical or biological weapons that wasn't defensive. In fact, what they had been doing was creating a lab secretly from equipment that they could buy in general merchandising stores or order over the internet. They built a lab from which they could create anthrax. They also developed an anthrax bomb, and they did a test to see if they could smuggle a bomb into the United States. They claimed that it had no detonator and no anthrax in it, but whatever it was, I mean, it was an attempt, and they said they had to do this in relation to what they thought were some developments in anthrax in Russia. It also was revealed there that Rumsfeld had ordered the U.S. military to develop the next grade of anthrax, a weaponized anthrax that would be more distributable, that would be fluffier, able to get around easier, and also that would be genetically modified on a new level that would be resistant to the antibiotics known to stop anthrax's lethality. These things were reported on the 4th and 5th of September. On the 6th, the DIA, following these articles, I guess felt embarrassed and held a press conference at the Pentagon, and the Defense Intelligence Agency announced their plan to test a new variant of anthrax that they had developed. It also mentioned in the news that day that the current ambassador to Belarus for the United States was someone named Mike Kozak. He had served under both Reagan and Bush in Panama, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, so he had lots of experience for the job he was being asked to do. On the 8th of September, Representative Ike Skelton in the Armed Services Committee said that the United States needed to reposition its military troops in the future near the Caspian Sea. He said that would be the next hot spot. And in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski had said that it was, in a book that he wrote back in the 80s, that it was necessary to control the USSR after it fell. It would be necessary for the U.S. to have a military presence in Uzbekistan. I woke up that morning, 9/11, because someone called when the first plane went into the first tower. Another researcher called me. He works with air traffic control there in D.C. area around the Dulles Airport. He sits on the local county committees. And he called me because he was very concerned that something very seriously wrong was happening. He knew that there should not have been a commercial aircraft anywhere near that building. And he called expressing those concerns, sort of feeling out what might be happening. And as we were talking about his concerns, the second plane hit. That was about 9:03, between 9:03 and 9:05. Once the second plane hit, both of us knew, and I'm sure anybody else that needed to know, in the intelligence establishment, they were claiming afterwards they needed more human intelligence at the CIA and the Pentagon, and I couldn't agree more. But, those people had to know at that point that coincidence theory is out the window, accident theory is out the window, and you've got planes attacking buildings. Now, this is not an entirely new method of operation, nor is it even a new method of operation for the people that are eventually blamed for the attack on September the 11th. The groups around bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the groups that were out of Afghanistan, trained by the U.S., had in fact crashed planes into buildings in Russia. They had crashed planes in Paris and in Chechnya. So this method of operation was not unknown to the intelligence agencies. But clearly by 9:05, you've got a problem that planes are being used as weapons, and you've got other planes in the air. By 8:25, NORAD knew that at least 4 planes, and there were early reports of up to 6 planes, but at least 4 planes had been hijacked and were off course that morning in a short period of time in relation to each other. And shortly after that, there was a great deal of activity relating to this plane that had gone out of Dulles Airport toward Los Angeles, turned around in Ohio, and was headed back to Washington, D.C. And it's reported in the news that they knew about that plane very soon after the second plane hit. There's one report in the news from William Safire that after the second plane hit, Secret Service grabbed Cheney and started to rush him down to the Situation Room in the White House. They record that as happening about 9:03, and they said that in the report that on the way down to the Situation Room, he was told that a plane was headed toward Washington, D.C. I got off the phone with my friend and turned on the local television news. I watched CNN, I watched Channel 8, and Channel 8 D.C. announced at least 25 minutes before the plane hit, and I know when it hit because it shook my windows. I'm right across the river from the Pentagon. So at least 25 minutes before it hit, it was announced on local TV that a plane was coming toward D.C. It was also announced that they were evacuating the Pentagon, the Capitol, and the White House. I grew up around D.C., and I know that it's the most restricted airspace in the country. They don't let anything in and out of there that's not supposed to be flying in there. It's not military planes or planes that are already And so, I mean, it's not an area where you can just fly around. I have seen, growing up in D.C., commercial aircraft or small aircraft go off course and stray into that space, and I've seen things come up out of the surrounding military bases or even within D.C. itself. Helicopters, other planes wag wings and push them back out of that restricted airspace. They have visual cover, they have radar cover over that airspace. So when something violates that airspace, it means that something's going wrong. Now, I tracked an earlier incident, you may remember this, that a small Piper Cub had flown into the front of the White House and hit at about bedroom level in the Clinton White House. And I woke up that morning and it said that a plane had flown in the front of the White House. They didn't know where it was from or whose plane it was. They didn't know who the pilot was. He was dead. They didn't know if there were other people involved. But not to worry, said the radio. The Clintons are safe. They weren't at the White House. The White House is under construction, and they're over at the Blair House, which is another house in the area near the White House. Well, I said, as I often said over the years researching these kinds of scenarios, I'm glad that there's no real terrorists. Because you've just told us you missed him over there, boys. He's at the Blair House. Okay. When I say there's no real terrorists, I did a talk in 1996 in Los Angeles about exactly this kind of scenario, because this is all that I've been seeing from the intelligence agencies over the last 20 years, is planning for terrorist or emergency scenarios like this, and then how do they develop a response, and how the response goes all the way up to martial law and an end of civil liberties in the United States. Now it becomes an excuse for militarization and other things. So they have plans for all this that they've been working on. And security is a growth industry. I read one thing that when the Pope travels, 2,000 people travel for security. That's a growth industry. If Christ had that much security, we wouldn't have a religion. Okay, so there's money in it, and there's plans to be made about it, and there's things to be done, and they have official plans, and they have plans that shift things around when these things happen. So the plane went into the front of the White House, and I called the talk I gave in 96 in Los Angeles, "Are you scared yet?" Are you scared yet? Because I thought that the development of what they were doing, and through these different instances, including Waco and the Murtaugh building and MOVE and these other things, that they were setting up things that would scare the American public, and I called it phony terrorism, counterterrorism, and the strategy of tension. That's what they call it in Europe, where the intelligence agencies use terrorism as a way to manipulate political opinion and gain certain types of political control. So then they said, later in the day, if you hadn't gotten the message, because the Blair House is also significant historically as the place where the nationalist Puerto Ricans tried to assassinate, or at least attack, President Truman. So there's already one signal there, but if that wasn't enough, they said later in the day that the Clintons weren't going to cancel their evening plans and that they were going to the Ford Theater. Just a coinky-dink. So I thought, this is a message to Clinton, but how did it get in there? And then they started having these official statements. First they said they couldn't see the plane when it came in because it was flying below tree level. There's modern radar. It was flying below tree level and they couldn't see it. It must have been above tree level before it got into the tree level down there at the mall, so why didn't they see it then? It came out of an airport in Baltimore. The guy flying it turns out to be someone that lived on the VA grounds in the Baltimore area on 100% psychiatric disability, but his son was quoted in the local paper saying, "My dad had keys to lots of planes." So I can't put those two sentences together. Maybe you can. In any case, he took off in a plane not his at a Baltimore airport, and there's no alert. There goes another one, Harry. Who do you think's in it? No alert, and he comes down into this restricted airspace, and he flies around, and then finally the official statement was, no, he was on the radar. We did see him on the radar, and it's on the tapes, but that was between 3 and 4 in the morning, and we don't look at the radar during those hours. I said, again, it's a good thing there's no real terrorists. So that was his first incident, but in response, the Washington Post said that they built a surface-to-air missile port in the front lawn. You can see where they built it. There's little bushes around it to protect the White House from anything else that ever flies in there. I know from the 1950s, because my parents were both employees of the Pentagon, And I used to go to lunch with them out in the courtyard, and I know in the courtyard of the Pentagon, back as far as the 50s, there were also surface air missile ports there to defend that building. And I know that that building was on alert from at least the mid-90s because I held a demonstration there and organized a demonstration in the Pentagon where they told me they were in a Delta alert in 1996 because of threats from Muslims, and they had to put up all this security. And they had aerial and radar security up in the sky around the building and everything else. And it was just unbelievable to me, I mean, given their mentality and what they have, that this plane then, for almost 35 minutes, is known by them to be coming toward D.C. It comes all the way across Ohio and into that restricted airspace. It flies over the top of the White House. It flies over the Capitol. It loops around. It takes a 270-degree turn from 5,000 feet. It flies so low it's hitting the lamppost, and it slams into the empty side of the Pentagon. The only side of the Pentagon is 270 degrees out of the way to get there that doesn't have any people in it. More people died in the plane or outside the building than actual Pentagon employees because that area for years, even going back to 96 when I did the demonstration, had been being worked on and reconstructed, so it was mostly empty offices. But there was nothing. Nothing went up. And it's not that we lack anything. Anacostia Naval Station, just south of me in D.C., the Naval Air Station down there is the home of the Air National Guard, and they have F-18s and F-16s and interceptor jets, and that's their responsibility, is that defense of that area. Andrews Air Force Base is just a little further to the south, and they have plenty of planes and things that can take off from down there, at least in 35 minutes, even if you're not sitting out on the tarmac. Nothing went up, nothing. Until too late to get there, they sent some planes finally out of Langley Air Force Base, 130 miles from D.C., to intercept these that arrived at the Pentagon 5 minutes after the plane had crashed into the building. Now that's stand down. That's stand down. Whether it was put up or not, that's stand down. Somebody let it come. And they let it come in there and do its business. And that was clear to me that day. What was also clear was that D.C. itself began to move into martial law. Not only the airlines shut down, the trains shut down, parts of the subway shut down, all the main roads in D.C. turned into outbound roads. They closed off sections of the interstate highway system, which goes to military during emergencies, and the government announced that it was in continuity of government, which means it's run by a very few people in the Congress and certain cabinet members and top-level officials out of these command and control centers. They have a war room in the Pentagon and a situation room at the White House, and they have other places out at the Strategic Air Command bases or underground mountain retreats where they can run the government from these command and control centers. And they went into that continuity of government, and the park police, who normally wear these little hats and take you around to show you the monuments, I could see them on local news standing at the corners with machine guns in their hands, and they've escalated it since. And so control over decisions in D.C. and the country also, in a declared emergency, go into the hands of the Defense Department, the National Security Council, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. 150 different legal authorities change over when you go into a national emergency like that. And you're in a situation where decisions are not being made except at the very highest levels of these concentrated sort of bureaucratic powers and these intelligence agencies. And that's how they were being made and have been made since, not just for D.C., but for most of the country. It's just a little more visible in D.C. because we're a colony, and we're a federal district, and we're a military district. Then on the 12th, James Baker said that we may have to accept giving up some of our civil liberties to protect the nation. And Tom Brokaw said we may have to re-examine some of our personal freedoms. And then also on the 12th, they began to reveal the beginnings of the evidence in the case. And that evidence that I saw coming out in the case was, to me, false sponsorship. This was a very sophisticated operation. You can't go to a puddle jumper school and use a flight simulator to figure out how to change speeds, change altitudes, bank planes at tremendous speeds into buildings, curve around like that, unless you're an experienced pilot. And when you have a sophisticated covert operation, I also know that you spend more time and more people on the operation itself, or I'm sorry, on the cover story for the operation than you expend on the operation itself, on the mechanics. And so the cover story will be more important. You put more people to that, more energy, how you're going to lie about it after it happens and what benefit you're going to get from it. And part of that cover story in most covert operations is false sponsorship and plausible deniability. Okay, and I saw that in the assassinations because you would have a patsy who was to take blame for the assassination while the real people organizing the event were not visible. And to give you two simple examples of that, there was a double of Lee Harvey Oswald, it wasn't Oswald, that went to a shooting range 2 months before the assassination, and he shot at another guy's target. And the other guy said, "Hey, you're shooting at my target." And he said, "The hell with you, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, remember my name." Well, he did. You see, and then it established that Oswald was there practicing his gun when they had no other evidence. There's also in Memphis, 5 minutes before Dr. King is shot, someone walks by Kneep's Amusement, a little pinball store next to a rooming house there in Memphis, and drops a bundle out front. And then after the shooting, the police find this bundle, and the bundle is a blanket, and inside of it there's a rifle that's been purchased, they eventually find out, by James Earl Ray. There's a prison radio that belongs to Ray. There's some clothes that don't actually fit him. But there's enough there to link the case back to Ray and make him the suspect and the gunman. So what was the very first clue in this? I don't know if any of you remember it. It was a fellow that called the FBI who had gone to Logan Airport that morning for a different flight and had tried to park his car and had encountered 4 Arab men in another car who he said got out and had a road rage argument with him over the parking space. And then later he remembered these 4 hostile Arab men, and he heard about one of the planes that come from Logan, so he called the FBI. Well, I don't know if the road rage argument took place. It could be that the guy who called the FBI is the shill. But I don't think that you'd have a road rage argument on your way into that kind of an operation. I mean, you're already profiled as an Arab. You want to be profiled as an angry Arab going into the airport? So, I mean, it didn't sound too likely to me. And then they led basically by the nose to the bundle, to the car there that's parked. And what's in it? Well, there's a Koran in it. A lot later, they say they also found these instructions in it on how to kill yourself for Allah, but that wasn't in there in the, in the first report. But there was a Koran in the trunk, and there was a flight manual for that type of plane written in Arabic in the trunk of the car. And I thought to myself, if you're going to bother getting a flight manual in Arabic, you're just going to bone up on it till 15 minutes before the flight and then leave it in the car? Why aren't you going to take it on the plane? So it looked to me like planted evidence, and then they named 19 people, but within a short period of time it came out that 7 of those people, 5 in Saudi Arabia, 2 in Egypt, were actually living people who said, "That's my picture, that's my ID, I wasn't in the plane, I wasn't in the United States, I'm not part of the operation." So we know that they were carrying false IDs. We also know that these people went around making pretty much a spectacle of themselves. There were reports on them already. Some of them were on FBI alert lists. One guy went up to one of the air pilot trainers and told him he didn't need to know how to take off and land, he just wanted to know how to fly the plane. That guy called the FBI. There were 2 of them in a bar in Florida the night before, making a spectacle of themselves and leaving a Koran on the bar. There was another 4 that moved into a house in Langley out near me, which is the bedroom community of the people, CIA, and one of the wives there called the CIA and complained because they were making such a nuisance of themselves. So these were not people laying low. They were people that were making themselves visible, and all of that fits to me with false sponsorship. At first I couldn't even determine if there were any Arabs on the plane. I listened very closely to all the cell phone reports, and for the first 3 days they said men with knives, men with box knives, men with bombs. There wasn't the word Arab mentioned. And having grown up white here in America, I know that the word Arab would be mentioned. And so I wondered who was on the plane. There was also a flight attendant who called in the seat numbers from a cell phone to the tower on one of the planes, but said that the seat numbers didn't match the Arab people that had been on the flight manifest seats. So I wondered who had done it. Now I got independent confirmation because one of my good friends and a fellow researcher is a flight attendant on flight number 77 out of Dulles, the one that hit the Pentagon, and thankfully, that's her regular run, she wasn't on the plane that day, but the crew died that she knew, her working friends and pilots that she knew. But there's also ground crew. There's people that take tickets, there's people that go on the plane but don't take off with the plane, and those people saw some of the people pictured actually on the plane. So I know that some of these people were part of the operation. I still don't believe that you can get 18 or 19 people involved in a long-term agreed suicide plot. Maybe they got 3 or 4 people somehow, but I don't believe you can get 8, because I studied mass suicides, and I started with a whopper of one called Jonestown. And when you go to the actual forensic evidence in Jonestown, there is not a single suicide in Jonestown. There's not a single body that shows cyanide pathology. These people were all murdered, and that's what the Guyanese grand jury ruled based on Dr. Mutu's evidence from going on the site. But we were told it was a mass suicide. And I went back through history and forward into other so-called mass suicides and found that in all cases they were mass murders. It's hard enough to get 2 people to agree to kill themselves and go through with it. Usually the first one dies and the second one runs. So I don't think that this is a case where you can get people. Yeah, you can have a kamikaze pilot, but that pilot's usually sitting in a 1-seat plane and they wait for a point of advantage in the battle when they can't do anything else, and then they crash the plane. I don't say you can't get a soldier to kill themselves, but 18 or 19 people together, you've got problems. So I began to wonder about it, but I think ultimately, if all the people on the planes relate back to Al-Qaeda, and if all the people were connected to bin Laden, that still doesn't tell us who is the ultimate sponsor of September the 11th. Because bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda are a creature of, financed by and created by Central Intelligence Agency money. They also have worked for Saudi intelligence and the Saudi royal family. They also worked for Pakistani ISI intelligence. They worked not only in Afghanistan, but in Kosovo. They worked with the Kosovo Liberation Army, which had CIA support and was also running opium out in that area. They worked in Paris. They worked in Chechnya. So there have been different operations on behalf of different people, and you can't just say, this is some sort of Dr. Osama bin Laden in his cave with his evil thugs. I mean, this is somebody that has a historical background in this period. Also, there were calls right away on the 12th and the days after that said that the CIA had been shackled by the Church Committee in the 1970s, and it said that the FBI had been bollocksed up by all of the revelations about COINTELPRO, and that had to be reversed so that the CIA could do whatever it wanted, and so it could go back to foreign assassinations. And the amusing thing to me that week, CNN went over and interviewed a top-level CIA analyst, and the guy said, these people are misled. We don't need that authority. Well, they don't, because they go ahead and do what they want anyway. And in fact, if you go to a hitman and say, I'm going to make you legal, his response is going to be, shh, you're going to blow my cover. I say, because he's better off saying it's illegal for him, then he's got a cover when he kills somebody. If you make it legal for him to kill somebody, then everybody that gets killed blames him. And so they moved anyway with the Patriot Act and other things to reverse that. And the COINTELPRO program, which had been responsible for destruction of much of the dissent against the civil rights movement and throughout the peace movement in the 60s and 70s, which had led to the assassinations of leaders, both local and national, is now being called back into duty by General Ashcroft. He wants to renew spying on civil and religious groups. And you might have seen a little piece in the Seattle Times this week, a picture of some demonstrators in Portland with something called the Earth Liberation Front. And the little journalism under the picture says, the FBI's top terror expert, James Jarboe, testified that the Earth Liberation Front is the nation's largest and most active terrorist group. I mean, I wish that it were true. But of course, I know the largest and most active terrorist group resides in Langley and over at the Pentagon, and has for a long time. But it's a perfect cover or excuse for them, to go into that. And then there were denials about the stand down. The officials at the Pentagon said that no mechanism existed within the U.S. government to notify the various departments and agencies under such circumstances. That means you paid $13 trillion since the end of World War II for a building that can't defend itself. There's no mechanisms, they said. They told the CNN that President Bush had not given an authorization to the Defense Department to shoot down a passenger airline until after the Pentagon had been struck. But CNN on the same day, the 16th, said that Cheney and Bush discussed a shoot-down and authorized it in the moments after it became clear that the United States was under attack, meaning when the second tower was hit. And so they had authorized a shoot-down on top of that, not just an interference, but an actual shoot-down of the plane. Going back a little bit, there's an interesting parallel if you want to look at it. In 1998, New York Times reported on August the 23rd of that year about Clinton sending 75 cruise missiles into Afghanistan and Sudan because those countries were harboring a terrorist named bin Laden. And somebody responded, a professor of international law from the University of Michigan, in the letter section of the New York Times that day, that the real victim of the attack was a world in which rules matter and those responsible for acts of violence are brought to justice, not simply killed. So they moved forward on what they were doing. They also had this story that floated around for a little bit that Bush was under threat and that there had been a direct threat to Air Force One, that Air Force One is next, and that the threat had used a code word for Air Force One that wasn't supposed to be known outside of the White House and the Secret Service. And then there was speculation that there was a mole of the terrorists inside the White House. I would suggest again that rather than a mole for the terrorists, that we're talking about some evidence of an inside job. It was clear to me that they didn't want Bush around that day, and that they did things in order to keep him out of the city. Quite a few things actually, but he was moved first to Maxwell Air Force Base and then to another Strategic Air Command and Control Center off at Air Force Base in Nebraska. And in fact, he kept complaining because he wanted to go back to D.C. And the way he finally got back to D.C. was that the Secret Service got him to sign a waiver releasing them from authority to protect his life. And then he was able to fly back to D.C., but for a long time he was, and Cheney was urging him not to come back. Cheney, meanwhile, Condoleezza Rice, the head of the Secretary of Transportation, were down in the White House Situation Room actually calling the shots. It came out shortly after people started to put together the funding levels of the Taliban and the history of how they came into power, and that there were elements to try to stop the funding by surrounding countries, like Iran had sent delegations to the United States to stop the funding, that the Taliban had sent its own secret delegations to D.C., and that it was clear that the United States could have arrested or stopped bin Laden at different points had they wanted to, and that $6 billion in U.S. aid went into the creation of the Mujahideen and the Afghan war. That Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates had all assisted bin Laden in a variety of countries. So right after 9/11, a new axis forms, I believe, of these neoliberal powers, and on the 12th of September, China jumps into the World Trade Organization the day after. On the 13th, Russia sends a signal that they will comply with the proposed violation and end of the ABM treaty by Bush. The new president is elected in Belarus on the 13th, not the one the U.S. wanted, so the European Union refuses to recognize the election. And General Singlaub and Richard Armitage make a statement that day warning of an upcoming chemical or biological warfare attack. Those two are important. They're part of Oliver North's team for the Contragate stuff. And one of the people that was the main funder for U.S. funds to bin Laden was the head of Pakistani intelligence. And he was fired afterwards. He was dumped in late September out of Pakistani intelligence because he had been too close to bin Laden and because they said that he had passed $100,000 in August to Mohammed Atta, who's named as one of the masterminds and one of the pilots in the September 11 attack. So he's dumped, nobody else in the command structure, but he's dumped out of there because of, I think, image purposes. Similarly, a Saudi head of intelligence they said was too close to bin Laden, and they took him out slightly before the attack. But this guy that was taken out of Pakistani intelligence had been the main conduit of funds for the CIA through to bin Laden. And on September the 4th, he was not in Pakistan. He was here in the United States. He was meeting at Langley with the Central Intelligence Agency, and he was meeting at the State Department with Richard Armitage, this former operative of Bush's operation. It also came out that Muhammad Atta, the guy that he gave $100,000 to, a Sarasota, Florida paper, printed the fact that one of the, a small group of about four of the people involved in September 11th, including Muhammad Atta, had spent some time living in a house in Florida with one of the Iran-Contra pilots. So there may be a connection with the old North Network that hasn't been fully fleshed out. And then we get Singlaub and Armitage warning of a coming attack. On the 17th, reserves are activated for several years for a 10-year war, up to 500,000 reserves authorized. Not that many have been called up yet. And Brian Williams on NBC asked, what did we get for the tens of billions of dollars we paid into intelligence to defend this country? Orrin Hatch, on the other hand, was asked on the 13th, would he support funding the Taliban into power again, and he said it was worth it. Brzezinski said the same thing in an interview that he did in 1998. Coleman McCarthy, a local peace activist in D.C. who writes for the Post, pointed out in the past 20 years, the United States has bombed Libya, Grenada, Panama, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yugoslavia, Sudan. Those are the ones we know about. And that the Pentagon spends about $9,000 a second with the current budget, and it's, of course, gone up since then. They also quoted the pilot on the 13th of September who trained the people at Huffman Aviation in Florida. Rudy Decker had trained a number of these people in the operation, and he revealed there that the changing speed and the altitude and the maneuvers were too sophisticated for anybody who was trained on a simulator, and he also revealed that the simulator they were trained on were not for the kind of planes that were used in the attack. Anatoly Kurukin, who's the Russian Air Force Commander-in-Chief, was quoted as saying the attack would have been impossible in Russia. He said, if it happened here, I'm reported to, and right away we'd be all up. On the 14th of September, it was also reported in Moscow Times that Russia asked for a $775 million bank loan from the United States. So these are the people moving into line. For the first time in history, not even at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis did this happen, NATO invoked Article 5 for support of the United States and whatever was to happen after that. And Financial Times and others reported that bin Laden, shortly after the incident, was under house arrest. And you may remember there were some offers by the Taliban to turn bin Laden over, which would have been the procedure for international law on a crime. We didn't want a crime, we wanted a war, and so we said we would negotiate with terrorists, and that was that. I don't think we really wanted bin Laden either, and still don't. He's worth more as a will-o'-the-wisp that can move from country to country than he is as somebody dead on a slab. And then they began to admit that there were some problems with the evidence. Colin Powell said the evidence ought to be made public. Bush's people said it ought to be kept secret. They went and showed it to the British because other people can see evidence that we can't here in America. You know, it's secret to us, but not to the rest of the world. It's like Ollie North admitted, you know, that the Contras in Nicaragua and the Nicaraguan people knew about the war, and the Russians knew about the war, and the other countries knew about the war, but it had to be kept secret from the American people because we're the ones that are responsible for it. So they showed it to the Brits, and the Brits said, well, it won't stand up in court, but it's good enough to go to war. And of course, we're talking about a logic from that point on out of the mouth of the president and these officials that has nothing to do with international law or even common jurisprudence. That's posse justice. Wanted dead or alive. We'll bring them to justice, or we'll bring justice to them. The justice and military retaliation or death are then merged into one thing. We don't need international tribunals. We can have secret military tribunals that will run. We began to break down the separation between military and judicial function. Senator Warner calling openly for an end to posse comitatus. That's a bright line that was made again into law at the time of the Civil War. It's one of the constitutional principles. We knew what it was like living in the United States when the British had their police and military functions combined. When they combined them in Nazi Germany, it was called the Gestapo. We know that there's a reason, civil liberties and otherwise, for those not to be the same, but now they want to take that away, and so they're creating a situation where we're going to be the accuser, the prosecutor, the evidence collector, the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And let's just skip all that stuff in the middle. Let's just accuse and execute. That's good enough for us, and that's justice. So that's all being mixed together, so you can't separate out what is retaliation and what is justice, even to the point that they've gone against all Geneva Convention and other international procedures in relation to these people that they captured, claiming that, you know, they're not really POWs, but they're not either criminals, and that there's something called, you know, unlawful combatants or illegal combatants. So they're both at once. But you don't have to treat them as a POW because they're illegal, and you don't have to treat them as a criminal because they're combatants in a war that isn't really a declared war. And so then they fall down the crack, and all they have to do is treat them humanely, and they don't have either basic legal rights or the rights of a prisoner of war. But this kind of confusion is just going on without hardly anybody responding to it. Back in February of '98, the importance of this region and the real reason that we went into Vietnam was partially revealed to Congress in testimony before the House Committee on International Relations, when the vice president of Unocal, one of the firms that wanted to build a pipeline, their vice president for international relations, John Maresca, testified that the Taliban government is an obstacle to the pipeline. When they originally made the plans in '96, both the Taliban and the Northern Alliance agreed to the pipeline, but then the Taliban balked in '98. So he was testifying to let them know that, to know that the Taliban was in the way. And then they actually did feasibility studies for yet another pipeline to go to the west instead, and that was run by Enron. And they did the feasibility study. In May of '98, the CIA set up a secret task force to, quotes, monitor the politics of the region and gauge its wealth. Well, that's what we do with the whole world. We monitor the politics and we gauge its wealth, because its wealth is what the people at the top want, not for all of us, but for the profit of a few. And Madeleine Albright said that she was excited about the idea of molding the area's future. You see, by 2050, it's projected that the bulk of our oil reserves and Europe's oil reserves will be exhausted. It's about 160 billion gallons between the two. It'll be exhausted in 25 years. So if you want to maintain an oil-dependent economy, then you need more oil, and that 80% of the oil is going to be up in the region of the Caspian Sea, which has about 800 billion barrels of oil. And so 80% of the oil reserve will be up in that area, and that's part of what they're going after. Cheney used to sit on the oil advisory board of Kazakhstan, and his wife sat on the board of Lockheed Martin. The vice president of Lockheed Martin was the finance chair of the Bush campaign, and Lockheed Martin got the largest defense contract in history recently. Enron financed the opposition to the recount in Florida, and after Bush father did the Gulf War, the corporate profits in Kuwait doubled. On the 18th of September, the BBC confirmed that there were other pre-planning meetings with officials in the region and U.S. officials about the war in Afghanistan coming up in October that had taken place back in July. On February the 6th, Russian military intelligence announced, that's this year, February the 6th, Russian military intelligence announced that the United States war in Iraq will be launched in September, and that Turkey and the Kurds will be recruited. Back in December of last year, Pakistan gave an exclusive oil contract for oil exploration to Halliburton. Cheney had been at Halliburton. Rice had been at Chevron. The Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Energy were both big officials with Tom Brown Oil. It's a fairly oily administration, but the other reason that they're in Afghanistan is that 80% of the world opium is coming out of Afghanistan. Tremendous amount of profits, and also the fuel for covert operations. One of the reasons I've always said that the CIA will not make its budget public is that it won't cover its operations. It's too small, and so then they'd have to explain where they're getting the rest of the money. And there's this international trade of guns for drugs and the covert operations that surround that trade. And so having control of all that opium there, the people that are being brought into this new moderate democratic government in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, which have a pretty brutal record in relation to women and in relation to the fighting that went on prior to the time of the Taliban coming into power, the top moderate leaders out of those circles are the people who were named 5 or 6 years ago in the London Sunday Times as the top opium dealers in Afghanistan. Mr. Karzai, who heads up the country and is the new appointed leader, was a long-term employee of Unocal Oil. The ones now I'm sure want to renew the pipeline now that Enron's down and the deal can be recut. And so you get, something in the news, and you have Bush and his wife jumping up and down about the liberation of women in Afghanistan, when in fact they were responsible for putting the women in the fix in the first place. See? So, I mean, you're not going to get, as Aeschylus, the Greek, said that the first casualty of war is the truth. And you're not going to get the truth from the people that want to fight the war about what the war is for, or whose interest it's in, or what it has to do with, because they don't want to tell you that. There's a book that's now translated into English from 2 French journalists called Bin Laden, The Forbidden Truth, and it talks about a guy named John O'Neill. He was an expert in the FBI on terrorism, counterterrorism. He had been one of the main investigators of the 1993 bombing of the Twin Towers by these same elements, allegedly. But he found that the Bush administration was blocking his investigation in the current period on behalf of the oil companies. And so he quit the FBI, he became the security director of the Twin Towers, and he died in the building that day. But he had made statements before his death about the government interfering in his own attempts to actually investigate what was going on. And there were reports in the French press and in this book that in about 7 weeks prior to the 9/11 attack, the CIA station chief at Dubai had a meeting with bin Laden in the hospital. So a lot of the progressive press that deals with this at all talks about blowback. I don't relate to this as blowback. Blowback is unintended consequences of an intelligence operation, a kind of Frankenstein thesis that you create this monster and then you're surprised when it turns on you. I've seen too many of these instances where the bomb goes off at the embassy, or at the Marine compound, and then it's a group that you've never heard of before and you never hear of since taking credit, and then 2 weeks later an article comes out saying the CIA trained and armed that group, but they never thought they'd do anything like that, and then they disappear into the news. And so I don't think this is blowback. I think there's ongoing control and interrelations with these operations. Then Singlob's and Armitage's prediction came true, and it came true in the form of some envelopes with a very lethal kind of anthrax. And the first envelope went to the headquarters of the tabloids. And I found that interesting. I mean, at first I didn't even know if it was a real story or just a tabloid story, because the tabloids, a lot of the ownership of tabloids is organized crime, and there's also involvement with the intelligence agencies, because the tabloids are read by a great deal more of the American public than the New York Times or the Washington Post combined. And they have readerships in tens of millions, not just 1 million or 2 million. And so in foreign countries, we know that the CIA will create and fund tabloid papers to put out the disinformation stories that they want to use to manipulate the population. So at first, when it came out that this next scare was reported as an envelope sent to a tabloid employee, I was suspicious of it. I did do some background research on the guy. He's a photo editor, and he was the first photo editor in the country to reveal pictures of Bush's daughters being arrested on the alcohol charges. And so he's the one that died there. And then they went after what's left of what, they like to call the liberal media, like somebody like Dan Rather or Tom Brokaw are liberal now. Well, I mean, they're only liberal because the paradigm and the scope and the domain of discussion, that we're allowed to hear, the debate that we're allowed to hear, is framed so far to the right in the last 20 years that it's between an open fascist and a moderate conservative. That's the debate. Which means that what a liberal was before is now what a commie was in the 50s. And it's a dirty word. And worse yet, anybody to the left of a liberal is a terrorist. And so that's the framework. But I mean, these were the guys that get the envelopes. And then, lo and behold, the envelopes arrive at Congress with the anthrax, and do they go to the party that's carrying on the war, that's running the White House? No, they go to Leahy and Daschle's office, who are the two main Democratic opponents of the Bush domestic agenda in the period coming up to and still complaining. So, I mean, what do you got here? Keystone terrorists, they don't even know what political party is in charge and they send it to Bush's opponents? Or have you got something else going on? Then they tried to say, you know, well, they thought maybe it came from the same terrorists, or maybe it came from Iraq, and then maybe it came from Russia, and they were going around in circles. They finally had to admit, when they did the scientific work and the genetic work on the situation, that it came from a strain developed here in the United States naturally. I mean, anthrax happens naturally, but it has a genetic strain called the Ames strain. And it's called Ames because the University of Iowa Ames did a lot of study on this strain, and they collected it, and they had vials of it for 70 years in the 1930s till now. They kept an archive of all the genetic modifications of this particular strain of anthrax. There was a story in the news on the 9th of November, and this isn't too far into the investigation. I mean, these envelopes had arrived in October, and they were starting the investigation. On the 9th of November, a call went from the FBI to the University of Ames at Iowa, and they agreed to destroy the archive. So the whole archive of 70 years of the vials of anthrax strain that this attack relates to are now destroyed, which means that the primary evidence can never be traced back to its actual batch of origin. However, they did enough science to find out that there wasn't aluminum deposit in it, which means it wasn't weaponized by Iraq, that it wasn't the type of weaponization that the Soviet Union was capable of or did. And so the final destination for where this stuff had to come from was in fact Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is the head of chemical and biological weapon research here in the United States. And the last publicly stated suspect from the FBI was the CIA. Well, when the FBI is going to blame the CIA and say that that's the main suspect, you've got something going on in the class. Okay? I mean, something's amiss here, you know. But that's as far as we got with that one. But it went around, and they really, I think, don't know quite what to do with it because the science took them someplace they didn't expect, or they're trying to spill the beans on each other and fighting each other with it. Bush announced recently that he wants Daschle to limit the investigation of September the 11th. I'll bet he does. And he wants to limit it to where did the federal agencies fall down that allowed the situation to happen. How was it allowed to happen, he says. And he doesn't want to take the efforts away from the war on terrorism when they do this investigation. And there's 26 intelligence agencies in the United States. They have an annual budget, that's very high, like $30 billion over a period of time, in a particular year. But we're told that they were unable to know that this was coming, even though they had warnings from other intelligence agencies. And then I have a quote from 1987. As I say, I always clip backwards. This is January 28, 1987. On the surface, selling arms to a country that sponsors terrorism, of course, clearly, you'd have to argue is wrong. But it's the exception sometimes proves the rule. George W. Bush, talking about the U.S. funding of the forces in Afghanistan. To go then back somewhat to the broader question, I think it's important to understand that this is not a war. It's not a declared war. It's not an act of war. It's a crime against humanity. It's a mass murder. But if you begin to replicate the crime and kill more innocent civilians, as we've already done in Afghanistan, if you respond to this sort of a thing with a cycle of violence and war, then you're just going to perpetuate it. We don't need frontier justice that we're asked to have. There's already exists international justice, international tribunals and procedures to handle these kinds of things. And instead of resisting them, they could have been used, and could have been used in a way that would have gotten to the truth about the situation, or still could. Instead, we're being asked to go into an endless war, a war that was predicted to last 10 years. Well, I know the wars will last at least 10 years, and I know that because my mother was the highest paid Pentagon employee for almost all of her 30 years career in the Pentagon, but for many, many years, the highest paid employee under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, directly under Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. My mother's job was to project the draft call. She had to project for the Joint Chiefs how many do they have to draft in order to keep the force level at where the Joint Chiefs wanted it to be. And they would give her statistical tables based on their experience, how many would retire, how many would die of natural causes, how many would re-enlist, how many would discharge under each category, how many would enlist anew, and therefore to have whatever force level they wanted, up or down, how many did you have to draft? She had to project that annually and nationally, and those calls got upwards 50,000 a year. And she had to project it annually and nationally right and accurately enough to be within 100 people either way on the call. And I remember her sweating them coming in. And those projections had to be made that accurately 5 years in advance. Okay? 5 years in advance. And they projected it, and whatever number my mother said they needed, they multiplied it by 5, she told me, and sent it to the Selective Service System as its quota. Why? Because 50 to 55% would flunk a physical, 10 to 15% would fall under a deferment or exemption, another 10 to 15% would no-show or refuse, and then they were back to the 20% they needed in the first place. They planned it. So I asked my mother after she retired, when did they tell you they would escalate the war in Vietnam? Because she had to be among the first to know. She told me that in April of 1963, for the first time in her career at the Pentagon, she was told to reverse her projections, to change her projections. She'd never been asked to do that before. She said it was on orders from the White House, which meant it was on orders from John F. Kennedy. She was told to change the projections to reflect a full withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam by the end of 1964. She put those figures into the projections. I said, when did they tell you they would escalate? She said, the last week in November. I said, late November, last week. I said, Kennedy's killed Friday, the 22nd of November, 1963. She said, the Monday following the assassination. He's barely in the grave, and she's given figures, and my mother couldn't believe the figures. My mother told me she took the figures back up to the Joint Chiefs, and she said, these can't be right. And they told her to use them, and I used to tease her that that was the first civilian protest of the war in Vietnam. The figures she was given on November 25th, 63 was that the United States was entering into a 10-year war in Vietnam with 57,000 American dead. Exactly on target. Till 73, 57,500 names on the wall. They know where they're going, they plan ahead, so when they tell you they're going into a 10-year war, you better listen. Now Cheney says it may be a war that won't end in our lifetime. Maybe they plan the next 10 years, for all I know. And certainly for all you know. And they've got a million excuses for it. They said they did it under the UN Charter for Article 51 allows self-defense, but that's only in extremis until the Security Council can meet and come up with some kind of an alternative. They didn't wait for an alternative. They've destabilized the region around the area. They've changed the negotiations and diplomacy with other people. But it's not just a matter of what are we going to do or should we be in Afghanistan or how we handle that operation. It's a matter of a global realignment and a global war. A war that, as they'll tell you, may go into 60 countries. A war that's going to involve the coming generations. I worked from 1964 on with the hope that future generations wouldn't have to face the kind of choices my generation faced in Vietnam, and these are worse choices the coming generation has to face. And they face all of us. Because all of what was done secretly that got us to September the 11th from 1945 onward was done in our name. And everything that's being done now in these countries around the world is done in our name. And we have to live with the consequences. We are in exactly the same position as the German people in September of 1939. Hitler has invaded Poland and lied about it to the populace. World War II and the Holocaust and genocide are looming, and we have to decide whether we're going to do this or this. That's our choice. It's done in our name, and it belongs to us. It's our country, it's our foreign policy, it's our military, it's our intelligence agencies, if we want them or we don't want them, what they're to do. But those decisions aren't made by asking any of us. They're made in secret behind closed doors by a few people, and we live with whatever decision they make because we don't live in a democracy. This is not a democracy in this country. A democracy would be a situation where all the people affected by a decision would make that decision. I mean, we may as well live on the moon for how far we are from that. We have a representative democracy that dates back to the technology of the 1700s when all you had for communication and travel was a horse or a wagon. You had to have a representative to go 200 miles to Philadelphia or New York and listen to what happened and bring you back a report and represent your point of view. You probably picked the person you liked the least to have around, got them out of the community for a month or two, and that was your representative. But as soon as you have mass communication and instantaneous travel, you don't need representatives. And in fact, there's too many people, the issues are too complex, the country is too big, and the situation is too important to allow 500 representatives to be making decisions for 240 million people on a global scale. Those decisions don't even belong to the so-called representatives. The representatives can easily be bribed or bullied or blackmailed or bulleted if they don't go along with the money that puts them into office. The problem is not only that we don't understand what's happening around us, that we aren't allowed to know what's happening around us. That's a piece of the problem. Martin Schatz, in a book about the Kennedy assassination called History Will Not Absolve Us, opens with a quote from one of his letters to one of the other critics, and he says, the political paralysis in America rests in the fact that we are allowed to believe anything, but we are allowed to know nothing. And when you cannot know, you cannot act. So you can believe it's gray aliens from the Pleiades, the Illuminati, or you can believe that it's the Pentagon, but until you can know something, you don't have a way to make decisions. But even when we can know, and it's not impossible to know, and I know that from doing my own research, it's not impossible. It wouldn't have been impossible for a German to find out about what was being done in their name either. It might take a little work. But when you know, and when you disagree, there are no mechanisms extant to have popular will become actual policy in this country. There isn't any way to express that will. We have a bumper sticker in D.C. because we don't even have a voting representative. In Congress, it says taxation without representation. But I would argue even with a voting representative, you don't have taxation with representation. Maybe if you directly allocated your taxes when you paid them, that would be taxation with representation. And you don't have any way to make a decision about a policy or to make decisions about what the world is going to look like around you. On the other hand, you have so much power that the system goes to these lengths of lying to you and manipulating you and controlling your press and doing whatever they can to steal the space between your ears, as Orwell says, because they're afraid of you. And they're afraid of you because you are the last power on earth that stands between them and the genocidal plans of the wealthy few at the top of this heap. You are what's left. There aren't any other little countries that are going to stand up to a military machinery that's been built up to a level that makes the Nazi Hohenzollern machine look like a rubber band affair. The genocide that we're capable of and have been carrying out in the military of this country has no parallel in human history. The amount of money we're spending on defense far outweighs the next 10 or 15 countries that have any kind of military might added together. There's nothing out there in those terms to stand in their way. The only thing standing in their way is the consciousness and the will of the American people, who are, because of the theft and the relative privilege of those people, 4% of the world population, consuming 65% of the oil and the resources. And one of the great ironies about the 65% of oil that we consume is that it was projected by this time, 2001, that 85% of the oil we consume is for military use. That means that you're going to fight wars to protect oil to have enough oil to fight the war. Schwarzkopf admitted in a 10-year celebration of the victory in the Gulf War that they had used 3.5 billion gallons of oil to fight the Gulf War. How much oil do you think they could get out of a year in Kuwait? But that relative concentration of the wealth puts you at the top of a pyramid. It puts you at the top of a communication system. You have resources here that no other people in the world have. And we are in a period now, objectively, in human history, of post-scarcity, of surplus, of a technological development and knowledge that makes it possible with less labor to feed and clothe and house and communicate to and transport and set up reasonable infrastructures for all the people on Earth. Overpopulation is not the problem on the planet. And also to preserve the planet itself, if that technology was used not to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, but used for human needs and human values. We haven't always had that capability in human history, but we do now. And so that's why the first article I wrote about the war back at the end of September was called A New War, which is what they were promoting, or A New World. Whether we want to make the choice to build a new world and to build that world based on a democracy that could involve all of us. And I think in order to do that, we have to not all join one main organization or one main party. We have to decentralize that effort down to the neighborhood, to the workplace, to the family, to the community hall, to the church, to whatever you're part of, to start a democratic discussion and debate about what's being done in the name of all of us in those institutions, in those little gatherings, and to build democracy up from the bottom. Eventually, we're going to have to take back some of the commonwealth that belongs to us called electronic media. It isn't owned by a corporation the same way a mine is owned. With a deed, it's only licensed out. And so the time that the corporations control could be bought back. But it's possible for us now to do what each generation is responsible for doing, which is to envision our liberation, and envision the liberation of the rest of the people of the planet. You know, it's just that we have a capability. We're at a crossroads, I believe, and we have some choices in front of us, but we can build up from the bottom, and we can make this into the democracy that it needs to be, because we basically rely on this system in many ways that we should not. But without opening up information flow, we can't go forward. So Jefferson said that there is ultimately no safe depository of the powers of a society except among the people themselves. And he said that if you think them unable to exercise their discretion in a wholesome fashion, which means you don't trust them or you think they're too stupid, he said the solution is not to take the power from them, it is to inform their discretion. You see, Jefferson said there are those who say that that men are not capable of governing themselves. His response to that was, are they then capable of governing others? We need to do the same thing that Jefferson did. Jefferson said that he would not even have his children wear a threadbare coat that he enjoyed. He wouldn't expect his children, if he built a structure around them for security purposes, to stay in that structure once the external threat had left. You know, Ben Franklin said those who would trade their liberty for security deserve neither. And Jefferson said that because he felt that in order to stop the power from accruing again back into the hands of a few, there would have to be a revolution every 20 years. Well, it's been over 200, folks. And nobody's been re-envisioning that liberation and re-envisioning what their democracy is, what kind of world they live in. And now we have the technology to actually create a world that takes human value into account and gives people back the thing at the bottom that's stolen from them, and it really, I think, is the source of all the violence in the world, which is the whole idea of social privilege, however it plays itself out along race, along gender, along caste, along class. Privilege is the first and most basic violence asserted in a society. It kills the human spirit. It creates the rage that leads to all the other violence historically. So if you end that privilege, if you restore justice, then you restore hope, and you know that, I mean, from a family argument. I don't have to go to an international argument with you. This is the way. You don't resolve it by fighting back. You don't go get even with somebody. All that does is create a feud, and it makes the violence cycle into yet another generation. The Paris attack bombings were done in part by young kids whose parents had been murdered by the French and the Algerian freedom-fighting wars from 20 years before. You know, if you get a veteran honest enough to talk about their war experience, they will tell you the dirty secret is that they take the dead with them. And I learned that from the Vietnam vets. You know, Violence is no resolution to an issue. It may seem clean on a TV movie, but in real life, violence has costs to you as well as the person you're violent against, even if you're defending yourself, and much more so if you're in some sort of an abstract battle with that person. You don't know what you're doing there, and they don't have any connection to you. So it's possible to get beyond that and get down to the bottom of it, but we have to be able to have some kind of a vision to do that, and we have to have some kind of mechanisms to do that. We have the technology for it. We could open up full debate on issues. We could decide not on candidates, but on policy. Because Jefferson and George Washington and the early people that even in their visions saw parties, political parties, as opposed to democracy. Jefferson said, in any political society there can only be two parties no matter how they name themselves. The parties who want to take power out of the hands of the people as a whole and put it into the hands of the few, and those are the aristocrats. And then there are those that want to take power from the hands of the few and put it into the hands of the people, and those are Democrats. But Jefferson said once you have a constitution in a democratic society, you don't need a Democratic Party. And Washington said in his final speech as he was going out of office that policies should be decided by the people as a whole. And he said that therefore parties would put that decision back in the hands of a few. So even in their vision, we're not as close to democracy as they were or were trying to be. And we're certainly far from what democracy could be given what's open to us, and far from the kind of human community we could be part of, a global community we could be part of, that would include real safety and real security, because that would come out of how we treat other people. And it would come out of what role we play in the world. If we're being attacked because we're a large, prosperous, pluralistic, democratic nation, why isn't somebody bombing Canada? You know, well, think about Canada's history of relations and think about ours. And maybe it would inform you in something. If violent response to terrorism, which is, as they say, asymmetrical warfare, it means a smaller, weaker group, a certain party of people that use violence and then they're backed by other people who feel a long string of abuses. If you respond violently to that, I mean, Israel and Palestine is a pretty good example that that's not the way to resolve the matter, or Israel would be one of the safest countries in the world. Okay? I mean, it's obvious to anybody that thinks about it that you have to go the other direction, and that the way you end what you're calling terrorism is to restore justice, is to restore hope. And then the sanction and the support for violence in those communities diminishes and it goes away, because instead you have the sort of natural, civil, and community structure that all of us would have were it not for the fact that we live under the demands of capital and its accumulation. We live under a situation that miseducates and undereducates us, a situation where it's hard for us to find out what the truth is about our society or our world, and a situation that values us the same way that miners in the 1930s were told that when the mine begins to collapse, you push the mules out first because it costs money to replace a mule. That's the position we're in relation to the people that hold the wealth in this world. We are expendable, and they're going to escalate that expendability. And the choice, and the power is there, but the choice to recognize that power and take responsibility for it and make this into a world where all of us can live sits right here.
Thank you, John Judge.